Hey guys, how's it going? It's Jay. And in this video, designed really for beginners, I'm using the Sony a7 III. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a couple of different modes. In particular, I'm going to go over the A mode, which stands for aperture priority mode. I'm going to go over the S mode, which stands for shutter priority mode. And then I'm going to go over manual mode. This video is really more for beginners that are looking to get a little more advanced use out of your camera. So if this is the first real camera you've had, or the first really good camera you've had, and you want to take it off auto mode, and you want to try to explore more, get more out of your lenses, for example, and things like that, this video is for you. All right, so for starters, I'm in A mode. On the top of the dial here, I have it set to A, and you can see that here on the screen. Now, right now, I have it set to flexible, expandable spot for my focus mode, and I'm focused on this quarter right in front here. So you can see in the lab, in the background, I have the bokeh balls. It's just a set of lights I have set up. Now, right here, this F number, that stands for your aperture. So it's saying it's f2.8. And what that means is that's basically how big the eye of the lens is, like the aperture diaphragm eye. And that's adjustable. When you turn this dial right here on the Sony a7 III by default, you could see that number is changing. Now the aperture, like I said, it's like the eye, so it controls how much light comes into the sensor. So when it controls how much light comes in, that will change the shutter speed, as you can see here. So watch, I'm going to change the f-stop. So when I change this number and it goes to a higher number, now it's f3.2. Now it's f3.5, and you notice the shutter speed is right here on the left. Now it's 1/40th of a second. Now just watch the shutter speed as I turn the aperture. Basically, I'm making the eye of the lens smaller, which is making it harder for the light to travel through to the sensor. So because it's going to take longer for the light to travel through to get a correct exposure, this is your metering exposure right here, it's slowing the shutter down because it's going to take more time in order to get all that light into the sensor. So let me just scroll this all the way up to f11. You see now it's a quarter of a second. So it's going to take a quarter of a second to get a proper exposure using f11 in this particular lighting environment. And I also have the ISO set to 100. So if you have the ISO set to auto here, that will automatically adjust and it'll keep your shutter speed at a faster value. So I have that set to 100 for this demonstration. So let me just turn it back to f2.8. I'm using the Zeiss Batis 18mm f2.8 lens right now, so it's a prime lens. Now another thing the aperture does is it controls the depth of field. So you can see now I'm focused on the quarter right in front of me there. Let me just get the focus point where I want it. And you can see that the lab scene in the background is a little bit blurry, and the bokeh balls in the background are nice round balls. Now again, watch when I change this dial here. When I put it to f8, you could see now the balls in the background are a lot smaller, the bokeh balls, and also the lab scene itself is a lot sharper. That's because the depth of field is beginning to open up. It's getting larger. So the faster the aperture, the more narrow the depth of field is. And what depth of field is, that's basically the amount of distance of optimal sharpness. So when I'm focused on the quarter, basically right here, the depth of field is probably about 6 inches, in front of the quarter, 6 inches behind the quarter. There's a depth of field sliver there. And when I bring it down to f2.8, for example, now the depth of field is much more narrow. So instead of it being 6 inches, now we're looking at 2 inches or something, just for an example. So the depth of field gets thinner and larger as you stop the lens down. So for example, right now, you might have heard the term wide open. For this lens, f2.8 is wide open. So I'm going to stop it down to f16, for example, and so now f16, you could see pretty much everything is sharp from the front all the way to the back because the depth of field is very large. So if you're taking a landscape photo, for example, you're going to want the aperture set at a higher value if you want everything in the scene to be sharp. If you want the subjects in the foreground and the background and the middle and everything all in between sharp, you're going to want your aperture pretty high. Somewhere around f11 is a good place to start. However, the higher you go in the aperture, beyond f8, f9, f10, you will start to see a little bit of softness creep in. It's known as diffraction. But if you want everything sharp, you're going to have to stop it down to f16 sometimes even higher. And you can see this lens goes all the way to f22. And notice now at f22, in order to get a proper exposure, the shutter speed is going to have to be 1.3 seconds. So that's because the aperture eye is almost all the way closed. So there's not that much room for all that light to come in. So you might have heard the term fast glass. You know, why would you buy fast glass? Well, you buy fast glass because the bigger the eye of the diaphragm aperture, the more light that gets in to the sensor. So in other words, the lower the ISO needs to be in order to get the photo. So you're going to get better quality photos in low light situations. So that's why lenses that have faster apertures cost a lot more money. Like f2.8 versus f1.4, for example. You might see like f4 zooms versus, you know, like the 70 to 200 f4 versus the 70 to 200 f2.8. The reason the f2.8 is so much more money is because the glass has to be much larger in order to allow all that extra light to come in. And why would you want that? Well, you want faster shutter speeds in lower light conditions without having to have the ISO at insane values, because you don't want your images to be noisy. So you want the ISO as low as possible in order to get the cleanest images possible. So that's a quick overview of aperture priority mode. And when you're in aperture priority mode, basically you can control the aperture and the camera will take care of everything else for you. If you have auto ISO set, that'll also make the shutter speed much faster. So let me show you that real quick. If I go into function, I can just go here to ISO, and if I change that to auto, like this, now watch what happens when I change the aperture. See how the shutter speed is staying at 1/30th? So the camera's doing that math for you. It's saying, oh, you want to keep the camera steady, so I'm going to keep the shutter speed at 1/30th. But if you press the shutter halfway down, it'll tell you what the ISO is set to. So the camera's choosing ISO 200. So let me stop it down to like f16, and we'll see how high the ISO goes. See, now it's at ISO 2000. Do you see what I mean? So that's what happens in lower light conditions if you want to try to take a shot, you know, with this setup like so. All right? So that's a basic crash course overview of what aperture priority mode does. It allows you to control the aperture independently of the other settings. And if you have it set to auto ISO, the camera will automatically keep your shutter at a higher rate to make sure your images are sharp. But if you hit this knob here on the right, you can then change your ISO to 100 to keep that locked down if you're using a tripod or something, for example, all right? Let's go to shutter priority mode. So I'm just gonna turn my dial. And now I'm in shutter priority mode. And you can see the screen went dark. And that's because I have the shutter set to 1/250th of a second, and it's telling me that there's not enough light. So the exposure is gonna be off. So I have to change my shutter speed. I'm gonna have to slow it down. Now watch what happens when I slow the shutter speed down. Notice how the exposure is starting to come back. See that? So right there, 1/60th of a second, looks like a proper exposure. And now you could see the aperture is stopping up. So if I want a 1/13th of a second exposure, the aperture is automatically changing. So the camera is automatically changing the aperture to accommodate my shutter speed, because that's what I have the camera set to, shutter priority mode. So when I turn this dial, the shutter's changing. So if I want a 1/4 second, somebody asked me a question on YouTube the other day, and they wanted to know how I got a 2-second exposure basically for blurry water shots. And this is basically how you can do it. This is one way. You can put it in shutter priority mode and you can dial it to get the longest shutter or the longest exposure possible. So right now it's 1 full second. But that's all you can do. There's not much else you can do to slow the shutter down. I have the ISO pretty much as low as it goes. I can lower the ISO to the expandable, so I can go to 50, for example, and then I can get the shutter a little bit slower if I stop it all the way down. So now you can see I got 2 full seconds at f22. So that's a good way to do it. Another way to do it would be to use tinted glass. Let me just change my ISO back to 100. All right, and that's 10-second exposure, and you can see now it's overexposing. So that's why the screen looks so bright. So let me slow this back down, get it right around there. And that's proper exposure. So you could see the shutter speed changing there. So to freeze the action, you're going to want a faster shutter. But again, in order to slow the shutter speed down, they make tools. And we have one here. It's called a ND filter. It's called a neutral density filter. And what that does, it basically like puts sunglasses on in front of the lens. So I have it here. You see this dark lens here? And that will slow the shutter down if you put it in front of the lens. So let me just show you what I mean. You see how the screen just went black there? That's because it darkened what the camera can do. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to slow the shutter speed down in order to expose for it. See that? So this is a great way to get super long exposures. Now look what I got to do. I got to have this thing set to 30 seconds in order to get a reasonable exposure, even longer. So I would have to use bulb mode basically in order to get it longer than 30 seconds. And I'll show you that when I get to manual mode. So that's what a neutral density filter does. It's like a tool to help you slow the shutter down depending on the conditions you're shooting in. So if I want to freeze the action, for example, I have a fidget spinner here, all right? So if I want to freeze that and make it look, solid, I would have to get a fast shutter speed. So first, let me show you what it looks like with a slow shutter speed. So 1/15 of a second. And let's show you what it looks like. See how it's all blurry? You can see it's all blurry there. All right, so now it's spinning a little slower. I'll show you again. Play, and you can see how it's blurry there just that little bit? So if I want to freeze that action, I need to speed up the shutter. So let me dial up the shutter speed to 1/200th of a second. Let's try that. See that? So it froze the action. So if you're shooting sports or something, you're going to probably want it at least 1/500th of a second, depending on, what kind of sports you're shooting. Let me just put this to auto. So I got 1/500th of a second. I tend to use auto ISO when I'm using shutter priority mode because it just automatically will adjust. Like I want that shutter speed is very important. So I usually just have it set to auto ISO like when I'm shooting sports or something. So now 1/500th of a second should probably freeze this. Let's see. See that? All right. So it froze the action. So let's dial that shutter down to 1/10 of a second. Let's get this in a better spot. And if I play, you can see again, now the thing's all blurry because the shutter is staying open for 1/10 of a second. So that's going to allow the fidget spinner to spin multiple times within that exposure. So that's how that works. If you go to manual mode, if you turn the dial, now I'm in manual mode. So you can use auto ISO if you want, even in manual mode, or you can set that to 100, if you want, or whatever ISO value you want, using the exposure triangle, for example. So exposure triangle means ISO is one element of the triangle, aperture is the other element, and shutter speed is the other element. And this right here in the center is critical when you're using manual mode. That is the exposure value. So right now it's blinking because the image is overexposed. So I need to slow the shutter speed down. So if I slow the shutter speed down right about here, now you can see everything stopped blinking. So now I have a proper exposure. And there's another dial on the front of the Sony a7 III, and that controls the aperture when in this mode. So I can dial the aperture in independently and the shutter speed independently. And also ISO I can dial independently as well. If I want, I can just go in here, put that at ISO 100. And now that I have the ISO set to an actual value, you can see the metering mode there is telling me it's underexposed by 0.7 of a stop. So if it's underexposed, that means I have to either slow the shutter down, right? So I just slowed it down to 1/50th and now I'm at 0. So I can also raise the aperture, and now, because I opened up the aperture, now I'm letting more light in, so now my metering is telling me it's overexposed. So if I change the shutter speed now, you could see it's overexposing like that, 1/60th of a second, now I have a proper exposure. And you could use the metering mode there for that purpose. So again, if you're using manual mode and you're shooting sports, for example, you might want a fast shutter speed. So let's get the shutter speed up to like 1/500th of a second. All right, so we're at 1/500, we're at f2.8. So what am I going to do? Like the only other adjustment I could make is the ISO here, right? The aperture is as fast as it goes, so I can't speed it up that way. The only other way is to raise the ISO. So let's raise up the ISO until we get a proper exposure. So somewhere right around 800, let's say. And there you go. So now ISO 800, we have a proper exposure there. You can see it's at 0. f2.8, 1/500th of a second. So if I was shooting sports, for example, in this lighting environment using manual mode, this is what settings I would use. I would have the lens set to the fastest aperture possible, shutter speed I want at 1/500 to make sure all the action is frozen, and then the ISO, I want that as low as possible to make the images as clean as possible. But in this case, I'm going to need to have it at ISO 800. Obviously, I would rather have it lower, but this is the fastest the lens goes. So if I was using a f1.4 lens or an f2 lens or something faster, I would then be able to have the ISO lower. So that's basically manual mode. You have the dial on the front here, right past the shutter button. The shutter button's right here. You just go around the front and there's a dial that controls the aperture. And then this dial here controls the shutter speed. And then if you want to control the ISO, this is by default settings, guys, by the way. You just click this button here and you can change the ISO. All right, so I'll put it at ISO 400 and there we go. Now we got a good exposure again. So when you're in manual mode, notice the shutter speed over here. Remember I mentioned bulb mode? You might wonder if you have the Sony a7 III or any Sony camera for that matter, how to get to bulb mode. Some camera manufacturers do it in a different way. But on the Sony, what you have to do is you have to be in manual mode and then you just have to dial in the shutter. So you just got to keep going, making it longer, 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 longer. Now you're in bulb mode. So you go beyond 30 seconds and then boom, now you're in bulb mode. And if you don't know what bulb mode is, it's a more advanced exposure mode, but basically what bulb means is you just press the shutter down and the longer you hold the shutter, the longer the exposure is going to be. So that was a pretty quick shutter. I just pressed it and let go. It was 1/10 of a second, as you could see right there. All right, so now watch, I'll take another shot and I'll hold the shutter down. So ideally you're going to want to use a release cable, like a shutter release cable for this, because you don't want to have your hand on the camera while you're taking the picture. You'll shake it, you know what I mean? So you have a remote plugged in or something like that in order to get the bulb mode. So there's f8 and let's see what it looks like. And you can see it's totally blown out, which makes total sense. I held the shutter down for like 5 seconds. Yeah, so basically that's bulb mode. So you can dial it back. Now I'm at 30 seconds. And again, you could see the exposure. It's +2. It's more than +2 right now. That's why it's blinking. So let's get it down to right around here. All right, so that's +2. It stopped blinking. So it's exposing 2 stops over normal exposure. So you can then dial in the aperture to bring that down. See that? We're in manual mode, so get it down to 0. So there's a correct exposure according to the camera's metering system. It all depends on what metering mode you're using as well. More videos on that to explain those in the how-to area. So be sure to check out the how-to videos on my main channel. Just go to the main channel and you can check out, scroll down, you'll see the how-to video area. Just click that and then you can check out all the how-to videos. And I have one on metering modes, and pretty much all the Sony cameras are the same. They just vary in like some features and stuff, but all the fundamental concepts are exactly the same on all the Sony cameras I review. So those how-to videos are totally relevant to this camera as well, even though I might have done it with the RX10 or the RX100, for example. It's the same thing on this camera pretty much. So just check those out, all right? So that is pretty much a crash course of aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, and manual mode. So, I really tried to keep it simple. I didn't want to get too involved here, but that's basically how it works. So I really hope you got something out of this video. If you guys have any other questions, just let me know below. I will also have that illustration for the exposure triangle available for you, so you can check that out. And you could use it as a reference guide if you're not sure what settings to change in any given scenario. That'll help you with that. Be sure to subscribe, be sure to check that notification icon, and also be sure to like the video. I really appreciate you giving it a thumbs up if you got something out of this, and I will catch up with you guys next time. All right, take care.